Well, I would like to welcome everybody to this meeting this morning. I acknowledge that it is being hosted from the land of the Gadigal people. I pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I acknowledge with respect the Aboriginal leaders and elders who have joined this meeting today. This is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. And I'd like, on behalf of the City of Sydney branch of the Communist Party, to welcome Michael Mansell today. Michael is a Palawa man from northeastern Tasmania, and he is widely respected as an elder of his people and a man who has fought all his life for Indigenous rights of all kinds. He's a lawyer, he's an activist, he's a speaker and a writer. And if I may, I might say he's also a very dear friend over many years, even if he did once break his leg to avoid coming to Sydney. We're very grateful and very pleased to have Michael with us today to start a discussion about, after the referendum, where to next. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Hannah. Just for the record, there's no doubt I'm in the elderly department, but I'm not an elder. I'm just older. Anyway, I'm happy if people just call me Michael. We all know that leading up to October last year, the whole discussion was about the referendum and the voice to Parliament. And since then, there's been an absolute void. There's been nothing happening. The Prime Minister sounds like he doesn't want to hear the word Aboriginal again after his loss in the referendum. He wouldn't even agree to the symbolic change of January 26th, moving Australia Day to another day. And so there really has been nothing happening in the last few months. And with the new year coming on, we need to create some sort of an agenda, some sort of strategy. 20%. And we need to be able to, start coordinating some sort of effort to bring about justice for Aboriginal people. I know that a lot of people would have... I'm getting an echo.
Sorry, there's somebody, Kerry Sculthorpe is speaking. Could you please mute?
Yeah, got it. Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, a lot of people would have seen over the last several months that there's a lot of Aboriginal people who are lining up to be the next Governor-General of Australia, or looking around for some sort of a recognition from white Australia. And we're in an era, I guess, where, looking back on it, this is probably the most conservative Aboriginal movement that we have witnessed in the last couple of 100 years. And during the push for the referendum, most Aboriginal people who were seen on the media were clearly advocates for assimilation. and that's fine, but we should distinguish between people's personal preference to be part of Australia, to be assimilated as part of Australia and get all the rewards as part of Australia on the one hand, from, on the other hand, the entitlements that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are entitled to. And it's that second category that I'm more interested in, rather than the personal preferences that people are advocating. And if we are to have a quick look at what Indigenous people in Australia are entitled to, so that we can develop some sort of strategy and coordinated effort. There's probably the best source of it is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has been around for a long time. And the three core elements of that declaration are that Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal people are entitled to self-determination, which for some countries overseas, for example, East Timor, means they are entitled to independence from the people who colonised them. Under international law, that doesn't apply to Aborigines or Torres Strait Islanders, and the best that we can hope for under the self-determination principle is self-government or autonomy under the Australian Constitution. I mean, that's just the way the politics have turned out. The second core element of the declaration is the right of Indigenous peoples to have their traditional lands returned to them, and the rights and the rights of a bit of competition there, and the rights that we had over those lands are to be restored. And the third category of rights under the declaration are the right of Aboriginal people to, and in the Indigenous peoples, to preserve our culture in all its forms. So they're the three key elements, and of course they have a number of sub-issues relating to those core issues. But I mention that because a number of people will say, well, how is having a referendum to put Indigenous peoples in the Constitution as advisors rather than decision makers consistent with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And that's a fair question, and it's a debate for another day, not today. But consistent with those three core principles of the Declaration of self-determination within the nation-state of Australia, return of traditional lands and exercising the rights that we used to have, and the preservation of our culture and language and all those sorts of features. A number of ideas have been proposed over the last 20 years by different Aboriginal leaders, for example, and all of which are consistent with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous.
Sorry to jump in. Can anyone hear me?
Michael is muted.
Yeah, I know. Michael, could you unmute? Sorry, I accidentally muted everyone.
You'll have to stop doing that to me, Dennis, when you don't like a couple of points that I read.
No, I agree with everything you say.
Okay, I think I'll just quickly restart. A number of different Aboriginal leaders have expressed different strategies which are all consistent with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I was mentioning that former ATSIC chairman, Jeff Clark, for example, has advocated for the restoration of the strategy of uniform national land rights legislation that Bob Hawke talked about in the 1980s. Les Malzer, who's the prime international representative from Australia, or one of the representatives from Australia, as you heard Lydia say before the meeting officially started, is advocating for the legislation and incorporation of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into Australian law. I have advocated, among others, for a number of designated Indigenous seats in the Senate. It'd be 6 out of the 76. And you could argue that some of these things, like designated seats, are not necessarily finding their source in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which you could say it is consistent with it because it gives Indigenous peoples the right to participate in the political processes that affect us. But you could also say some of these things that we bring up are part of Australian democracy anyway, whether we're Indigenous or not. And if there's a large, distinct segment of the Australian community that's not being represented in the Parliament, and I don't mean here those Indigenous people who are represented through political parties and who have to toe the party line. I'm talking about the rights of distinct peoples to elect their own people to the Australian Parliament. Then you could say that's part of representative democracy. And also, I have advocated for the seventh state, for the amalgamation of all the lands that Aboriginal people get back, and on those lands we would form the seventh state of Australia and have the same rights as all state governments. And that, of course, is in the current climate, not within a bull's roar of the discussion that we need to have. But if we relate what I've said so far about the core rights of Indigenous people have been laid out internationally under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and different strategies have been embarked upon by Aboriginal leaders and Torres Strait Islander leaders in Australia, the next step seems to me to go back to Uluru, because consistent with the Declaration is the unfinished business where the Prime Minister said that he would implement the Uluru Statement in full. And the unfinished business is a truth-telling commission and a treaty. I don't think Uluru talked about a national treaty or a state treaty, but because it was a national gathering, I think people clearly had in mind that it should be a national treaty. And the Prime Minister has said that if he was to implement the Uluru Statement in full, clearly he's talking about, as a Prime Minister, a national government, and talking about it on a national scale. So the real question for us in terms of, if I could hone it down into the next steps about a treaty, if that's the way people think we ought to put our focus, is whether we should put our eggs into a state treaty or a federal treaty. Because as we know, the Northern Territory are talking about a treaty. Tony McAvoy completed his report in winter last year, where he laid out a template for a national treaty based on what he recommended in the Northern Territory. We know that Queensland, Victoria are talking treaty and have taken some steps. The Tasmanian effort at treaty has come to nothing, and it looks like the New South Wales effort will come to nothing. So should we put our efforts into a state treaty or a federal treaty? And all I want to do is just basically lay out the reasons why we should consider a national treaty is better or should be done at the same time as state treaties, and certainly should not be forgotten. First of all, a national treaty would provide a standard response for all Indigenous people to a standard problem of dispossession. We were all dispossessed, and there should be a national response to it. If we rely on state treaties, some states will have a treaty, some of those states will have good treaties and others not so good treaties, and some states will have nothing. And so you get an inconsistent standard applying across the board to Indigenous people, arising out of the same circumstances. The second thing is that a national treaty can provide, based on Tony McAvoy's Northern Territory report, some core elements. It could return Crown lands to Aboriginal people over a period of, say, 20 years or so through a process set up by the treaty. Secondly, depending on the circumstances of each of the Aboriginal groups who receive the land back, a whole range of rights could accrue to the land that they receive. Thirdly, there would need to be a national Aboriginal body that would determine the priorities of the needs of Indigenous peoples and have the resources to be able to respond to those priorities. And because we're talking about a national treaty, we need a guarantee of resource, and that resource could be 3% of the gross domestic product, which, if it was in a treaty, gets us away from having to go to the departments with some budget application every year. The fourth importance of a national treaty is that it is binding on the states. And so the states can't pass a treaty 1 year and 5 years later get rid of the treaty. A national treaty is binding on the states. It is also binding on the federal parliament until the federal parliament chooses to override it. It's binding on business, on the courts, on the police, on the public, on local governments. It is binding on everybody in the whole country because it has the force of federal law and therefore takes priority over state laws. A number of people have raised the question of whether, instead of having a national treaty, we should have 300 treaties because of 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. In my view, that's unnecessary. You can have national legislation that applies to everybody depending on their circumstances. For example, the Racial Discrimination Act 1976 applies across the board to every person who's discriminated against depending on their circumstances. The Native Title Act applies to all Indigenous peoples around the country depending on their circumstances. And so there'd be no reason why a national treaty legislation couldn't apply in the same way as the Family Law Act and a whole range of other federal laws apply across the board. If there was to be a national treaty, I've already mentioned that the states can't interfere with it, but a future federal parliament could. This raises the question of how can you ultimately protect an agreement that's worthwhile protecting under the Australian Constitution. Well, this is where we should have had the referendum. Instead of having the referendum to set up an advisory body, which could be set up administratively or legislatively, and leaving the referendum to when it was absolutely necessary, we went in a bit early, and it would have been a good ace to hold up our sleeves that if we had a national treaty in the next decade or so, then we could cement that treaty in Australian law by establishing some process in the Constitution that probably said this treaty cannot be interfered with unless both parties agree to the changes or something like that. So they're the points that I wanted to make this morning. I don't want to go on and we've all given up church this morning to come to this. And so having outlined what I think are the core issues, that is, we shouldn't be focusing on the personal preferences of individuals who have got the ear and eye of the media and pushing a particularly conservative view. We should be focusing on the entitlements of Torres Strait Islanders and Aborigines, and should be looking at the different strategies that we can put our efforts into to bring about some form of practical change. I know that Albanese has had his fingers burnt with the referendum and probably doesn't want to hear the word Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders again. And it may well be that nothing of any substance is going to happen nationally until he's gone. But we live in hope. So having said all that, Hannah, I'm happy to have a discussion and listen to what other people have got to say.
Thanks, Michael. I'll hand over to Comrade Lily, who I think is chairing this discussion. Lily, do you want to take over now?
You'd have to unmute yourself.
I'm off mute.
I muted everybody, so you can unmute and you put up your hand if you want to ask a question using that device. You know how to put up your hand.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, best you put your hand up.
Thanks, thanks, Michael, as well for taking us through everything. Yes, if people want to raise their hands or indicate in whatever other way they can to ask a question or make a contribution, that would be great. I have Asmi. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Uncle, for the points you made. I'd just like to raise one point actually about the 300 treaties. I absolutely understand where you're coming from and the practicalities of 300 treaties, but I think UNDRIP, which is the minimum standard, and it's by no means a fantastic standard. The colonizers really whittled it down and then voted against it. So, you know, we've got something that is less than what was ideal. But I think self-determination is important for each of the tribes, Uncle, and to, I know you're not saying force a national treaty on everybody. It doesn't preclude the possibility of treaties further down the track, but I think it should be clear that each self-determined group should have the right to participate, either both as a smaller group and as a national uniform group across the country. It's just a point. It's not a serious point, to be honest.
Oh, no, it's a good point. Good point.
Thank you. Did anyone else have something they wanted to say or questions?
Yes, I did. I can't put my hand up because I can't find it.
We've got you. Go for it.
Jim Everett here. I agree with what Michael's put up in the sense that we must remember it's a domestic agreement, so we'd still be under the colonial system's legislation, which makes life difficult always, as we know. I don't know. I can't contribute much more to that to say that, you know, we shouldn't or should go ahead with a domestic agreement treaty. It may be a good first step towards a more solid treaty under a sovereign agreement of some kind. Look, the only thing I can add to this is that I'm already well ahead now with the plan. I will be getting arrested sometime this year. I'm not too sure when, with Bob Brown, protecting forests on the west coast of Tasmania, but I'll be springboarding from that and be getting arrested a few times until they drag me into the courts, and then I'll stand on my sovereignty and challenge them on citizenship. I think that if we can force them to have that question in the truth-telling that Albanese may sort of bring up, then I think that we've got a right to know if they can prove that they made us citizens and we made an agreement with them to do so, what were the conditions, or otherwise agree that our sovereignty still stands. It needs to be tested, and I think it should be a question that goes up to the truth-telling. And so I'm going to do what I'm going to do to push that up. I think that once we, if we can push them to the point that they admit that they've never, ever made any agreements with us to be citizens, then I think that the whole discussion towards a treaty will be different. So that's all I can add to it. But in the meantime, I think what Michael's put up may be a really good first step. And whether we get anywhere with what I'm going to do, well, we won't know that until I do it. And I'm hoping that lots of people will get this up highly in the media, so we push it into truth-telling. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Alyssa?
Hello. I can't figure out how to lower my hand. Sorry, my question for Michael is there any countries around the world that he feels are sort of doing this kind of stuff in the correct way, or like show just generally a good way to go
Hello,
forward?
can anyone hear me?
I'm thinking specifically with like countries like Bolivia, who I know have like a plurinational type thing going on. I'm just interested to hear what his opinions are on that kind of thing.
Yeah, Bolivia, with its attempts to give Indigenous people seats in the parliament, its constitution, even in America, the United States state of Maine has seats for Indians, and Australia can't bring itself to do it. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't just have a reconciliation commission like we did in Australia. It also had the truth telling. So there are plenty of examples, and of course, as far as political participation is concerned and treaties, you only have to look across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand. They're miles ahead of us, and while they're under threat at the moment, in terms of answering your question about what other countries have done, the standards that other countries have set is far ahead of anything that we've got in Australia. And yet, by seizing the moment, you can see that in Western Australia, it probably couldn't be called a treaty, but the West Australian government made the southwest the Noongar settlement, which gave 300,000 square hectares of land back to Aboriginal people, and I think gave them $12 million or something. I can't remember the exact figures. And so action can all of a sudden be brought forward. And don't forget the Northern Territory, the report done by, I would recommend everybody read the report done by Tony McAvoy that was produced in, I think, June or July last year. And so there are all of these things going on both internationally and domestically that we could use as leverage to put the pressure on Albanese and his other senior ministers to say, well, look, your government promised to implement the Uluru Statement in full, and here are the different forms that can take. Let's get on with it.
Hello, it's Daly. I'm not sure whether I'm connected. It's my first time using Zoom. I'm not sure if anyone can hear me.
We can hear you, Dale. Did you want to make a contribution or ask a question? If you have...
Yeah, I'd like to just make a contribution if that's possible.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Hannah and Dennis, are you fine for me to circle back to you?
Yes.
Yeah. Go, Dale.
Go for it, Dale.
My apologies. First time I've ever used Zoom by myself. I'll just go back to a comment Michael made at the beginning also. about him not recognising himself as an elder. I just want him to know that all the years I've known him, he's got my respect, and I acknowledge him as one of our political activist elders. But I've been involved in our struggle for a long time, since our old people sort of passed my responsibilities on to me. And I lean towards the comments that Jimmy raised about our sovereignty and how important that sovereignty is to our meaning as the first people of this land. I've encountered native title now. We're part of the native title process over here through our Kondamuka claims, and I've seen the disadvantage that that's brought to us as a people, and it more or less forces us into a situation where it takes away our sovereign rights and forces us into complying with the common law conditions and circumstances that are relevant to being recognised as native title holders. And I think it diminishes our First Nation rights as original sovereigns. But just recently, after a long time, like we've had native title on Stradbroke Island and Moreton Bay here now for just about 12, 13 years. And throughout it all, not all of us consented and agreed to the process because we thought it was unjust and that it was going to take away our First Nation rights and our rights to racial equality. But what we've started and we're in the very beginning, and I've corresponded some of this and shared it around, is before we go into state or federal treaty processes, and I'm hearing a lot of good stuff said here today, because of how divided we've become as a result of what Michael mentioned earlier, some going for the benefits and privileges and others sort of maintaining the ground. I think we as a people need to get ourselves right. And so what we've tried to do just up here through a few elders groups in Southeast Queensland is develop up Aboriginal group to Aboriginal group First Nations treaty model, which is binding us together on meaning and binding us together on representation, and it's relevant to our re-establishment of governance on First Nation sovereign grounds also, because we've seen already what the state treaty process has involved, and we've raised issues to the state in relation to what we think are necessary for resolution through the treaty. And the state's come back to us and more or less just told us outright that all the issues that we have identified aren't relevant to be negotiated in that treaty progress movement. Also, I've got just leaned back to UNDRIP, and I know UNDRIP's very important to us as a people. But when we get to the last principle of UNDRIP, all power is still invested in the state. So it's keeping control over our ability to be fully self-determined as original First Nations people. And just going back to what Jimmy's raised, it's what I've always believed in. And a lot of us over here on our land have just taken our sovereignty really serious, to the point of where we oppose the whole native title process and structures. And through our First Nation inherent rights, blood inherent birth rights, we've gone out and repossessed that land back, and we've been occupying it now for the last 40 years or so, in a state of full conscious resistance to state and federal legislative and political processes. So I just go back to my earlier comment. I think before we move forward as a people, we need to try and unify. And I think the best way we could do it is through a treaty amongst all the nations themselves, which formulates, hopefully, if it's able to, a national position, because I see the communities as being divided, and I live in a divided community over here, where governments continuously use the prescribed body corporates, who are a part of the common law structure now, as the fourth tier of government, to do all of their engagement and consultation with, and that excludes quite a few of us from our involvement, and it's unfortunate and sad. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that contribution, Dale. Hannah, I'll jump over to you and then to Dennis.
Thanks, Comrade Lily. First of all, my thanks to Michael. As always, I think he offers us a very clear analysis and also a way forward. And I think that that's really important for not just us in the Communist Party, but obviously far wider. I think Dale's point about unity is actually, for me, something which I think is key in this question. I would see the discussion to formulate the details for a national treaty, a discussion predominantly within the Indigenous community, that is something which can unify the movement and also give leadership to the solidarity movement, which is much wider than the Indigenous communities themselves. I think that it seems to me that that discussion could actually be a unifying force and help to create a very strong movement, not tomorrow, obviously, but certainly over a period of time. And once the discussion is concluded about what the basic principles of a national treaty would be, that would be the basis, it seems to me, of a resurgence in the movement after a lot of, I mean, amongst many friends, a lot of depression about the loss of the referendum and the resurgence of really negative positions following, like the Liberals pulling out of the Victorian state, discussions like a variety of groups refusing to do an acknowledgement and so forth. You know, it's a negative position to some extent. I also have reservations about having 300 different small treaties. It seems to me that the concept of autonomy based on collective ownership of land actually creates quite a range of possibilities. It's a flexible concept which would underpin a national treaty, but would allow how that autonomy is expressed to be decided by local communities. I mean, the principles of autonomy on the basis of land rights would be sacrosanct, but exactly how that was exercised would be a decision for local Indigenous communities. And that could reflect the differences around the country while we still remain unified. So I think that what Michael has been suggesting today has enormous potential, and I'm confident that the Communist Party comrades, who I can speak for, will do everything they can in solidarity to assist that process. Thanks, Comrade Chair.
Thanks, Comrade Hannah. Dennis, over to you. If anyone else wants to jump in after that, please just pop your hand up.
Oh, I too would thank Michael for his really insightful comments. I'm interested in just what technique to use to belt the federal and state government, in our case the New South Wales government, around the head to make them move on things. I listened carefully to the speeches at the Survival Invasion Day rally in Sydney, and there were several points that I found a bit distressing. For the first point was that a lot of the speakers were from the Moree area, and they were reporting that there was a lot of cancer deaths, heart deaths of Aboriginal people in that area. They were also pointing the finger at Roundup, which is used for the cotton. They also talked about suicide, and I've seen references, and because I'm a former teacher, I have an interest in juvenile detention. And I know that there are just the most shocking and disgraceful juvenile detention centres around the country. And so I was just wondering what, where to sort of put our energy, whether we should be saying truth-telling, treaty, a sort of a gutsy juvenile justice sort of campaign. That was what I was just wondering what you and others thought would be what we should get our teeth into to, as I put it, belt the federal and state governments around the head in 2024.
If I can jump in on that one, and this goes back to a point that Dale and Hannah were talking about, specifically, the federal government have set aside $5 million for a national treaty. And Lydia is probably the only Aboriginal politician inside the parliament who is advocating for the bigger issue. If we can, hearing Lydia talk about what she intends to do in February when the parliament resumes, if between now and then we can all contact the other black politicians and get them to demand that the $5 million be released to Aboriginal people so that we can have a national treaty discussion in Canberra, probably at the old Parliament House. And it can be specifically on a whole range of questions that we're talking about here. So it just seems to me that's a good focus. The Prime Minister has committed to Uluru in full. He and his government have set aside funds for a national treaty. Where is the money? Let's get members of the Labor Party to lobby the Prime Minister, because we lobby them to hand over the money so that we can have that national gathering. And our focus should be on the other nine black politicians, to get them to not only back Lydia, but also to demand that the money be released so we can have a national treaty discussion earlier this year.
Mm.
Could I jump in and make a couple of comments too, please?
Go for it, Dale. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's great, Michael, and I think that discussion needs to be held, and it's something we've been denied as a people now, historically, the right to come together to decide on our future's fate for ourselves. Just going back to a couple of points just raised prior, with regards to how the state and federal governments could be hammered. I think before anything goes ahead, there should be a full historical truth commission that's facilitated nationally, and that truth commission, for it to be effective, I think Aboriginal people need to put pressure on federal government to agree that the Truth Commission can't be facilitated by Australian selected Assembly of Commissioners. It needs to be independent international commissioners that are appointed, ones that are familiar with First Nation sovereign rights and the movement of colonialism across the international nations. And I think that's so important to do before anything, because they've manipulated us as a people through a lot of their processes, and they put the whole referendum and the voice question up before they even knew the reality of the truth of this nation and how it's been established. Like, for example, this year, 2024 for us in Southeast Queensland is the bicentenary of the first military attacks on the blacks throughout the region, and next year follows with the establishment of the penal colony, which ended up becoming Brisbane City. So I think truth is so relevant to understand amongst Aboriginal people also, as well as the broader constituency of the nation, before there's much progression at all. Just going back to the other question around youth, and it's something we've been facing here in the Southeast Queensland region because of the number of our young people that are affected by the youth justice and the criminal justice system. And we've set up our own justice group here on the island. Federal government has come to us and asked us to partnership in the justice reinvestment modelling process, and we've questioned the extent of the justice definition, but it's pretty primarily focused on criminal and youth justice. So we've become involved in that process, but we've told them from day one, and we've stipulated it clearly, we'll be involved in partnershiping in that process, but our involvement is through our self-determination, and it's going to be about culturally owned and administered justice alternative initiatives. And in that, we're looking at addressing all of the issues that are affecting us and the broad disparity that's growing in relation to ourselves from the criminal justice system, the effects of recidivism, high rates of suicide, increased mental health, the whole lot. But that's something I think as a people we could be putting a lot of focus on due to their failures to implement things such as the recommendations of the Royal Commission into the Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, in which just allows for those disparities of disadvantage to increase further.
Thanks, Dale. I think, and thanks, Michael, as well, for your responses to Dennis's question about things that we can do next. I feel like there's so many really practical suggestions there. Dennis, was there anything you wanted to respond to either Michael or to Dale?
Did you say that to me? Sorry.
Yeah.
No, that answered. That was they've given us a massive amount to do, but anyway, that was great. Thanks.
Cool.
Can I just? I can't find my hand either, but can I make a comment? Lydia
Absolutely.
here.
Go for it.
I agree with all my elders that have spoken, and Dale. I think, you know, in terms of strategy, that's what we need to get lined up beforehand, because we need to be organised. We need to give them the solution, as Dale said. If we don't, they hijack it, they railroad it. It's what they've done in Victoria. We got 11 nations out of 38 sitting around the table making decisions for other people, whilst they log our country and open up new gas and seismic testing and all of that, whilst there's a treaty conversation going on. So the state ones aren't working, and they're bastardising. They're making treaty a dirty word for blackfellas, and the libs and the racists are making treaty a dirty word for, you know, the Australia Day celebration people. So my office, I've got a campaigner on board now, and we're ramping up our treaty campaign, and we're going to go around to all the communities just to educate people on what treaty is, so that they can have informed decision making when it does come round to them. But I've also written to the King and to the British, what's it called, where the embassy, asking why the King hasn't responded to my letter, because he shouldn't be coming here without permission or consent, and he needs to come here and talk to us about treaty. So even if we put pressure that way, the British embassy and the King, he needs to come to make peace. And if he doesn't, then we can't welcome him here, and we need to activate when he arrives. Mm-hmm. But everything that's been said is exactly what our campaign and what our strategy is for this year. And I'll continue to be guided. But just quickly on the Vic Treaty legislation, there's a clause in there that says that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people say that they are sovereign. That's embedded in the legislation. They would not acknowledge that we are sovereign. And the other two parts of that legislation is that it does not override the Cultural Heritage legislation or the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, and they're two pieces of very bad policy that allows that corporate control and the haves and have-nots. So we've got to be careful of those things. And finally, Annie Rosalie Kernoff-Monks did say we've got a treaty amongst ourselves. So I just want to remind everyone of that.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Back over to Hannah.
You're muted.
You're on mute.
Sorry. I wanted to thank everybody who's spoken. I think that there are a lot of really important ideas, and we are hearing leadership from a range of Indigenous voices. And I think that's imperative for us in the Communist Party if we are to continue our solidarity. And I always boast, and please forgive me, but our party, the Communist Party, was the first political party ever to come out fighting back in the early 1930s for Aboriginal rights, and we have to go on doing that. I'd like to suggest to comrades that we should suggest to our party leadership that we can immediately get comrades to organise a letter writing campaign to the Indigenous politicians and maybe our local MPs, demanding that the 5 million that Michael mentioned be set aside for a discussion about a treaty. I think, you know, there are a number of other campaigns which will importantly and necessarily continue, like about youth incarceration. There's a whole range of other matters, but the treaty one can be the unifying one and the one that could ultimately return the kind of rights that we want to see return to Aboriginal Indigenous communities. So I think, you know, to argue a $5 million treaty discussion campaign could be really a valuable thing that the Communist Party and its allies could try and develop as a very specific campaign. And I think we need to discuss that in our party as the first step we could take in solidarity. Thanks, Comrade Chair.
Thanks, Comrade Hannah. That's something I would absolutely second. We have a hand up from Anna as well.
Yeah, thank you, Comrade Chair. Of two things. One is in terms of our campaigning and the whole campaign, I'm just interested in the, I suppose, the order in which things are done, whether educating people about the truth of what's happened and truth-telling should be before treaty, so that there's a stronger base to build from, or whether there's simultaneous campaigns or treaty before truth. That's a question to, I suppose, our Indigenous speakers today, and I thank them all for their contributions. And I want to raise a point for us too in our campaigning, and that is that one of the factors, I think, behind the government's failure to respect Indigenous rights, to respect traditional owners and so forth, are the political donations of the mining, logging and other corporations, and whether this is an avenue that we can campaign around as well to put pressure on them to ban those donations. And that raises the question that we really are up against capitalism in fighting this struggle. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks, Comrade Anna. Michael or anyone else, did you want to respond to Anna's questions about, I guess, strategizing and how we structure our priorities? I think Dale's contribution kind of goes towards that, where he was talking about the necessity for the truth-telling process to kind of come first. But I'm keen to hear from everyone else as well.
Well, I know in Victoria that they're doing both at the same time. And because politicians are what politicians are, I'd be hesitant to, if the federal parliament were, the federal government were to take up the idea of implementing the rest of Uluru in full, and they said, we'll go for truth telling first, and then we'll get on with treaty. I think that they'd be shrewdly dumping the idea of treaty, so they could have discussion about truth telling for a long, long time. I think with Indigenous politics, when white people get benefits from the government, they can be doing 100 things on the one day, and the next day they do another 100 things for white people. But with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we only get one thing at a time. And I think that we should be careful that we don't play into the hands of that historical treatment or mistreatment of Indigenous people in Australian politics. And we should be saying, do both of them at the same time, and they can be done. They can establish a treaty commission based along the lines that Dale's talking about tomorrow, or at the first sittings of Parliament in February. They can do it. And they can also hand over the $5 million for a national treaty gathering so that Indigenous peoples can get together and work out where to from here in terms of treaty or treaties.
Okay.
Can I just add a bit there?
Sure, jump in, Jim.
I just want to go back to referendum to start with, because this is where my mind sort of worked from to where I'm going. When the change to the Constitution was put up for a voice to Parliament, it was the best distraction you could ever achieve. They really did it so well, because it distracted from that recognised in the Constitution. That's what they was after. You remember that Peter Dutton came out near the end of the referendum, the election sort of vote, that he said, well, if they can't get the voice to Parliament in there, he said, if I get into power, he said, I'll put recognised in the Constitution. That's what they wanted, because that means then that we'd be recognised in the Constitution and that we've accepted the Australian government as our government, and therefore we're citizens. My plan is to test this citizenship out in a different way than it's been done before, by not making any plea in their court. I'll probably do jail time, but it means that people outside are going to have to push this into the public arena and make it a big question, because the government and the First Nations of this country have never made an agreement on citizenship, and therefore we want to know what our status is when we sit down and negotiate a treaty. Are we citizens or are we sovereigns? I think that's an important addition to what you're trying to achieve, what Michael's put forward. But I do think in truth-telling, it's a question worth pushing very hard to get up. That's why I'm planning to do what I do. I've got a paper being published by University of Queensland Press this year. I don't have a time for it coming out yet, but I'm seeking it. So things are aligned. I'm waiting for Plebiscite to make a decision on the Tarkina on the west coast of Tassie. If she opens that up, I'll be getting arrested, and then I'll keep getting arrested until they drag me to the courts and we'll test them out. So I'm looking forward to having some support to get this up into the media once I start my activism on that particular issue.
Go, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, could I please also comment?
Of course, go for it.
Just first, just in response to the Jim saying, like, in our division as a community over here, we've seen how our native title body corporates partnered with state government for their initiatives, and how state government supports them economically. And we're currently in a major conflict over tourist initiatives where they've failed to address our social economic needs priorities. And we've got our embassy set up on a location where they want to spend money to develop up a big building to house the remains of a whale against our own people. And we could all end up being arrested for trespass and the Cultural Heritage Act, and the processes of it has failed us totally. So I think, and I also, in all of my involvement with groups that we have coming to the island here, I tell them outright that I'm not an Australian. This goes back to questions I think Michael raised back in the 90s, which played a big part of my own questioning reason. And I tell them I'm First Nation, Gurungal Jendavul Guri, and I don't deal with them on the basis of being an Australian citizen. And I think that's something really important for Aboriginal people to consider nationally, where we actually fit in this nation. Just with regards to the national treaty gathering, I think that'd be great, and I think the Truth Commission request could be paralleled with it. But I also know, like, just from our involvement here in national justice reinvestment modelling, they allocated 98 million for the whole of the nation to do national reinvestment modelling. Whereas, and we pointed this out to them at the same time in Queensland, they're building new prisons for $1.5 billion. And in the prison system in Queensland, Aboriginal men are just over 40%, regardless of us only being 3% of the national constituency. And in the females' prisons, they're right up over bloody 50%. And then in the youth detention centres, they're over 80%. But I just say that as an example in relation to the economic investment into our objectives as a people, and how 5 million to facilitate a national discussion is something that we should demand a lot more for. And I think in that national discussion, if we're going to focus on our objectives for treaty and what that should involve and mean for us as First People, I think we should also be looking at that Truth Commission and the importance of the Truth Commission, because I believe that it'll be the findings of the Truth Commission that will actually inform what a treaty should involve.
Thanks, Dale. I think that's a really important point that you make about that kind of disparity between where the government makes investments. And yeah, I think it's very true what you say, that, you know, 5 million is really a drop in the ocean to the federal government. And, you know, we should be demanding more. And I think the Communist Party people to be demanding more. And I also echo what Hannah dropped in the chat to Jim and to Dale and to Lydia as well, about to keep letting us know what we can do to support, you know, the various initiatives and campaigns that you're all working on. Dennis, I'll go back to you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, comrade.
Look, Dennis, just
for
Dennis,
everybody's.
So
I think, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Sorry, mate.
People are probably not aware. I'm sitting on a mutton bed island, and I have to drag some stuff down the beach, and time and tide waits for no one. And I can only do it at low tide, so I do have to go. Look, it's been a wonderful experience with you all. I hope we do all this again, and I'm sorry I have to leave early.
That's no problem at all, Michael. I really want to say thank you on behalf of the City of Sydney branch for coming and speaking to us, and you know, providing a launching pad for this really important conversation. And yeah, I really hope that we can do this again as well. And I really hope that our branch and our party can continue to support you know, the struggle as we move forward.
Wonderful. We'll look up.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
We'll link up.
All right, Dennis, I'll jump back to you, and then I guess we'll see if anyone has sort of closing statements they want to make.
I just want to let everyone know that the Communist Party building in Sydney is very close to Tanya Plibersek's office. It's about a 2-minute walk from our office. Her office is 2 minutes, and we have just started having a picket every third Thursday, I think it is, of the month outside her office about Palestine. But if there was, if you wanted us, I think it was Keith from the Tarkine Forest, that sort of, if you want us to coordinate an action outside her office at the same time that you're doing something in northeast Tasmania, we'll be more than happy to help. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I've just put a message there. I need emails to be emailing out. Once we start this action, Bob Brownell Foundation will be putting out emails to be, media releases to begin with, but I really believe that this issue of citizenship needs to be built up to be answered. I've been researching this since 1987, and I can find absolutely no evidence that there was ever any agreements on citizenship made. And in fact, even their own legislations were all over the place and only provided some, what you might call citizenship rights, where they were flopsy and they could be taken away if you didn't abide by the rules, for instance. So I think it's a major question to place before the government on the way to discussing the treaty, so that we can be sure of what our status is when we're negotiating the treaty with them. So that's about where I stand with things at the moment. I've focused on very little else. I agree with what Michael's saying with this idea of what is really a domestic treaty. A domestic treaty is still under their legislation, and I think if we can get ourselves to a position to overstep that and make them take notice, the one thing I'm sure that this colony won't like is having a heap of black fellas running around the place and they're officially not citizens. They will want to come to the table and make an agreement with us. So that's my part in the overall strategies being mooted at the moment. And whichever way, I'm going to stay with whatever the movement does, including what I'm doing myself, because I think one of us will break through.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks for dropping your contacts in the chat. I've taken that down and we'll make sure that we get in touch with you so you can keep us.
Can I just make a closing comment? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Dale.
Sorry for interrupting.
No.
I couldn't agree with Jim more. I think our sovereignty is just such an important issue, and it's something that Australians don't even want to consider. That to me is my priority, and it's been a life priority from elders before me as well, getting that sovereignty recognised as First People. In my experience and the experience of my elders before me, I know it's a harsh reality, but this country and its laws are about totally disadvantaging the First People. It's a country that's modelled to ensure the maintenance of white supremacy and the benefits of white privilege, while ensuring that Aboriginal people remain disadvantaged and sit in a political legal situation of inferiority. So that whole thing needs to change. Just regarding, I'll just make a final comment in relation to being around the corner from Tanya Plibisay's office. We've got a few issues before her already, also waiting for her to make big decisions about regarding massive developments in our bay here and the recognition of our intangible heritage as First People. And it's really hard to go through these processes because our culture is ancient and our values are ancient and our being is ancient. But unfortunately, we rely on a white female minister to determine for us what's culturally important and significant for federal recognition. And that in itself is a major disadvantage. But thank you to all the organisers for organising this meeting, and thank you for Michael sending me an invitation.
Thanks.
Nice to hear from you, Dale.
Thanks, Dale. I think that really sums up a lot of the conversations that we've had today and how important it is to kind of find unity as we come together. Did anyone else want to make any final closing statements before we wrap up?
Well, I do want to say thank you to the Communist Party for their support. It's been ongoing support since the 1930s. I've been well aware of that. Labor can't put their hand up on that one, but they try to.
Well, they
so
established
you.
the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders Act in Queensland.
Yeah. So thank you anyway to the Communist Party and Hannah and Dale. It's great to be able to get these discussions going. And I'm looking forward to a pretty active year with all of us. And I'll sign out too, I think. I've got things to do. I'm on my way home. I haven't been home for 3.5 months. So I better get back to Chuana, Cape
Yeah.
Barren Island. Hopefully this Tuesday. But again, thanks to everybody.